Good afternoon, everybody. This is Bonnie Vandermeulen, Training Coordinator for Wisconsin Facets. On behalf of our entire Wisconsin Facets staff, I'd like to thank you for joining us today. Our webinar today is entitled Other Health Impairment, Ways to Support Students. Our presenter for today's webinar is Eva Kopinski. Eva is a school administration consultant on the special education team at the Wisconsin Department of Public Instruction and will be soon starting her 13th year at the DPI. She provides training and support in areas of assessment and evaluation, attendance, discipline, suspension and expulsion, the support of paraprofessionals, teacher training program reviews, cross-categorical licensing, and the unique needs of American Indian students with IEPs. Eva is a program consultant for these areas in orthopedic impairment, other health impairment, and traumatic brain injury. It's my pleasure today to introduce to you Eva Kopinski. Eva?
Thank you, Bonnie. I appreciate the introduction, and hopefully some of you have heard me in the past, or if you haven't, I hope that I'll be able to provide the information that you're looking for, or at least some resources that you can use to do some further exploration. As Bonnie mentioned, I'm a school administration consultant at the Department of Public Instruction, but I'm also a DPI licensed school psychologist, and I've also worked as a technical assistance provider in the areas of the various titles under the Every Student Succeeds Act for 6 states for more than 5 years. I have been with the department, as Bonnie said, quite a bit of time, and I'm having my anniversary actually coming up on April 17th. It's amazing how quickly time flies when you're having fun, and the educators and parents that I've had the opportunity to work with sure do make my life fun. I also hope everybody's going to get a chance today to enjoy the sunlight, which I haven't seen that much this spring, but I'm glad to see that it's shining out there. And I also want to say thank you for taking the time out of such a lovely day during your probable lunch hour to listen to the information that I have to share. I will be mentioning at the end that I am in the process of reviewing and potentially revising the Other Health Impairment webpage that we have on the Department of Public Instruction website. If you have some suggestions of things that you would like to see on there or resources that you think would be helpful, please email those to me. My email address will be available at the end of the presentation. So I have the privilege of working at the Department of Public Instruction, and now with our new to you, but not new to me, State Superintendent Carolyn Stanford Taylor, who really has an awesome commitment to the needs of students, including those with disabilities and those who may be at risk of not succeeding at school. As a matter of fact, today she ended up just presenting to the Joint Finance Committee about the state budget and the importance of funding for special education. She's been always a great supporter, as had our new Assistant Superintendent, Barbara Van Haren, who was previously our State Director of Special Education. And I really have been very lucky to be part of working with our educators and parents in our states to try and help all students graduate college, career, or community ready. So as we're taking a look today at some of the ways that you can assist students who fall under the disability category of other health impairment, I need you to keep in mind that disability means an impairment and a need for special education. Sometimes we get so caught up in trying to prove that there is an area of impairment and that automatically means that student qualifies for special education. But that's not true. Qualifying for special education is only done when a student absolutely needs those supports to access the general education curriculum and content. And we do not want to misidentify students and provide them with special education supports when we do not require them. We've seen that can really end up having students not succeed to where we would expect them to if they truly do not require special education. So in our state and at the federal level, other health impairment, or OHI, is considered an impairment area. It's one of the more complicated areas because of the potential health conditions that can result in a student qualifying. And we're always going to be talking about what are the student needs. There is no one OHI program that every student will benefit from. We have to go back to that word I in the IEP, which is individual. So let's keep that in mind as we go through the information that I'm sharing today. So in Wisconsin, the definition that we have for other health impairment, and this may be a review or this may be new to the listener, it means having limited strength, vitality, or alertness. Those are three very important concepts to keep in mind due to chronic or acute health problems. So when we say chronic, that means long-term, or acute, which means that it could be happening very suddenly. Now, in our Wisconsin definition, we actually have some specific medical conditions. You must keep in mind that they include but are not limited to these conditions, but also having these conditions does not automatically qualify a student as having other health impairment. So the health conditions include a heart condition, tuberculosis, the impacts of rheumatic fever, nephritis, asthma, sickle cell anemia, hemophilia, epilepsy, lead poisoning, leukemia, diabetes, or acquired injuries to the brain caused by internal occurrences or degenerative conditions, any of which of these health conditions adversely affect a child's educational performance. So, for example, we might have a student who has asthma that's triggered, especially when they exercise. However, if it's well controlled and not very severe, it may not adversely affect their educational performance. It is something to keep in mind, but may only require that the gym teacher or the physical education teacher, sorry, I'm showing my age, the physical education teacher be aware, as well as other educators, but it may not be enough to interfere. Now, the federal criteria has similar ones, but they do have a few that they add. So again, asthma, attention deficit disorder, or attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, diabetes, epilepsy, a heart condition, hemophilia, lead poisoning, leukemia, nephritis, rheumatic fever, sickle cell anemia, and Tourette's syndrome. But really, it's very similar to the Wisconsin list, except they explicitly mention Tourette's syndrome. Now, that's really important piece to think about. And this happened because there were several other types of medical conditions that respondents to an inquiry that the department put out, and again, that's the U.S. Department of Education put out regarding which could be specifically included and mentioned. And they felt very strongly that it was important to mention Tourette syndrome because even though Tourette syndrome has in the past been considered a behavioral issue, it is not. It's actually a neurological issue. And
Excuse
that
me,
is,
Eva.
yeah.
We're getting a lot of feedback right now.
Oh,
I don't know what that might be
I
from,
don't
but
know if that's me. I'm hearing something too, but can you
yeah.
still hear me now?
I think it's a little bit better now. Yes.
Okay, maybe I was sitting too close. Okay, so again, going back to Tourette syndrome, it had been mischaracterized as a behavior issue when in truth it's a neurological disorder, and that would change how you would look at it and address it. But again, remember that just having it doesn't mean that the student will qualify under other health impairment and or require special education. So if we're providing or doing an evaluation regarding whether a child qualifies or not for other health impairment, this slide has some important questions that I really want you to think about, both as a child is initially being evaluated, child is being reevaluated, and or any time that the IEP is being revised, because these are issues that can impact how you're going to actually provide those services. So the first question, going back to that definition, are we seeing limited strength, vitality, or alertness? It is really, again, important to consider this when you're looking at the conditions that a student may have. Because they, for example, may have diabetes, but they do not have limited strength, vitality, or alertness. So they don't require special education or the related services. However, if it's diabetes that's not well controlled and the child has blood sugar swings, which may impact their vitality or alertness, then the IEP team may consider other health impairment as a disability area. This often comes up when there are conditions that might be considered for other areas. For example, when I first started working as a psychologist, Tourette syndrome was really seen to fall under emotional behavioral disability because it was considered something that a student had some control over, and therefore it was a behavior disorder. But as we now know, Tourette syndrome is a neurological disorder. It there may be times when a person with Tourette is able to control their behaviors or the tics, but that may not always be the case. And that's where accommodations, modifications, and supports may be required. So, limited those three areas, what might they look like? And again, we're going to keep this in mind as we start thinking about what are some things that we might do to help the student be more successful and better able to access the government curriculum. So for the first one, limited strength. That would be
Sorry, Eva, we're getting feedback again. I don't know what's happening, but
okay. Do you want to try bringing me in and out again?
that's much better.
It's better too, but I didn't really do anything different. Well,
That's
now it's quiet.
very quiet now. That's great.
Excellent. Okay. So maybe I just have to, maybe we have a gremlin that's making noise.
Sorry.
Nope, that's okay. And my apologies to the audience. I hope that that I'll try to go back again and review this slide. So again, talking about what limited looks like in the areas of strength, alertness, and vitality. And again, this is very important because this is how we're going to connect the identified areas to the areas of need, and then eventually to what are some interventions that might help us be more successful in helping that student. So in the area of limited strength, that might be an inability to perform typical or routine tasks at school. That may mean that they might not be able to sustain participating in class. It might mean that they are unable to make it from one end of the school to the other, when, especially at the middle or high school where they might have multiple classes. Limited vitality could be that they have an inability to sustain the effort when they're doing an activity, both physical or mental or social or emotional, or endure through an activity. For example, I personally have physical issues that result in an orthopedic impairment, and there's just no way I can stand for more than 3 or 4 minutes. If it's a task that required standing, that would be an area where I would be showing limited vitality. And the same thing for physical and mental strength. Those are areas that we may not think about, but yet mental strength is just as important as physical strength and can be just as debilitating if a student cannot maintain that strength. As well as that capacity for endurance, the student limited levels of energy, animation, and activity. So that's a little bit more, we're going to probably be able to see that, but sometimes we may need to also observe very closely to see if we're seeing those limitations. And then limited alertness. And this is probably where you're going to see the most, the impact of one of the areas is probably the most well known, I think, for other health impairment in our state, and that is attention deficit hyperactivity disorder or attention deficit disorder. And that's the area of limited alertness. And that might be an inability to manage and maintain attention, and that could be managing to, they may be focused on one thing so deeply that they cannot focus on other important tasks or related tasks to the activity. A difficulty of organizing or attending, of prioritizing environmental stimuli in terms of what to pay attention to, including a heightened alertness. So I know I personally have that issue. Sometimes there's something going on outside and that's all I can think about, when yet maybe I'm listening to a lecture and trying to take notes, but I'm very distracted by what's going on outside. As an adult, I've learned some coping strategies, but sometimes students and sometimes adults are not able to maintain that prioritization. So again, the possible conditions that you might see for other health impairments could include heart conditions, tuberculosis, rheumatic fever, nephritis, asthma, sickle cell anemia, hemophilia, epilepsy, lead poisoning, leukemia, diabetes, acquired injuries to the brain caused by internal occurrences or degenerative conditions. So that's not the same as traumatic brain injury, because that's an external force or condition. This is where those other things that happen to the brain would fall under. Tourette syndrome and attention deficit disorder or attention deficit hyperactivity disorder. But again, there are other conditions that could also result in that limited alertness, vitality, and strength. And you don't have to have limited alertness and vitality and strength. It just needs to be in one of those areas. So, as I said, one of the more commonly recognized and I would assume associated disorders is attention deficit hyperactivity disorder. And it's one of the most common disorders that affect children. It also affects many adults, and it can vary, its impact can vary throughout the lifespan. Symptoms can include inattention, which is not being able to keep focus on what's going on. Hyperactivity and excessive movement that is not fitting to the setting. So, for example, wanting to get up and move around in the midst of a movie is not necessarily going to be appreciated by your fellow moviegoers. And impulsivity, hasty acts that occur without thought and may have unintended negative consequences. And from the definition by the American Psychiatric Association, they estimate that 5% of children and 2.5% of adults have ADHD. But it is important to know that, again, we haven't really been looking for ADHD in adults for until more recently, and that might be an underestimate. Now, again, one of the areas that was specifically mentioned in the federal list is Tourette syndrome. I have to confess, I was always one that said Tourette's with an apostrophe S, but it is actually Tourette syndrome. And it's actually a collection of tics under a type of tic disorder. So the ones that we're aware of is Tourette syndrome, but there may also be chronic tic disorder where you have fewer numbers, and provisional tic disorder. And it depends on what type of tic is present and by the length of time that they've been present. So again, when we're talking about Tourette syndrome, and again, this is the one where probably most people assume or think about the inability to refrain from saying inappropriate words or swear words. But that's really not the only way. It's, again, you have to have at least 2 motor tics and at least 1 vocal or photic tic in some combination over the course of more than a year. I had one student who used to grunt, and the teachers were convinced that he was doing this deliberately to offend them and to disrupt the class. And he kept telling me that he didn't do that he wasn't doing it, even though I told him I had watched him in class and seen him do it. It took until I showed him a video of him in the classroom that he recognized that he was doing that. It was just something that he was unaware of. And he had other tics that had not been noticed. And it wasn't until he was in his teens and that several of us put this information together that he was diagnosed as having Tourette's. And people may have other motor tics or vocal tics that have been present for more than a year or less than a year, and that's where the chronic tic disorder or the provisional tic disorder come up. So you can have either or under those two other areas. One of the interesting things about Tourette and important for us to remember is that there's many things that end up showing up similarly or in conjunction with some of these medical disorders. For example, when it comes to Tourette syndrome, there are many other disorders that can be seen with Tourette, including attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, obsessive compulsive disorder or OCD, learning disability, and executive dysfunction, dysgraphia, which is difficulty writing, depression, sleep disorders, sensory defensiveness, social skill deficits, and many more associated disorders. If you're interested in reading more about this, I just attended the Wisconsin Tourette Association conference a couple weeks ago, and one of the books that they had available was the Tourette Syndrome and OCD Checklist. and there's more, it's cited in the resources section at the end of this PowerPoint. Now, Bonnie, are you still able to hear me? Because I'm starting to hear that feedback again.
Yes, it's coming back again, and I don't know why. So,
Okay, yeah, it seems to wax and wane.
yes, yeah, it was.
And
I don't know what it is. We had none before, and then all of a sudden, people if that are in attendance, if it's really difficult to hear, please let me know. And we'll just continue at this time, and
yep.
hopefully it'll go away again.
Yes, and if I need to, and again, as Bonnie said, let her know. We did it through the chat box or
the question box. Yep.
The question box. That way, if necessary, I can repeat what I've said, and I won't just keep moving on. Okay, then another area that it's, again, I've mentioned before, were acquired injuries to the brain, internal occurrences. So, for example, that could be impacts after a tumor, after having a stroke, after suffering from but surviving meningitis or encephalitis, or a brain bleed, which could be something different from a stroke, an aneurysm, or other injury to the brain that occurred after birth. So again, this is something different from traumatic brain injury, but yet it can look similar to, it just is that both the federal and the state level, the traumatic brain injury must be caused by an external force. Acquired injuries to the brain, internal occurrences fall potentially under other health impairment. So the intent today is to talk about ways to support students that have been identified as having other health impairment and require special education supports. Now, one of the things that can happen is that if the student has enough coping or compensating skills that they're able to manage without special education, but may need some accommodations, then what could be done is a Section 504 evaluation. It's important that if this is a possible consideration, that it be done at the beginning of the other health impairment evaluation. It should not be that, okay, they didn't qualify, but we still think they need something, so let's give them a 504 plan. There must be a deliberate letting parents know and getting permission from the parents to do that evaluation. It can happen at the same time as the special education evaluation, but it's something that parents must have the right to say yes or no to. So, either way, if we found that it's other health impairment, how do we know what to do in order to support the students? Well, we have to go back to what the U.S. Department of Education said in the Federal Register. Special education related services are based on the identified needs of the child and not on the disability category. This is so important. It's going back again to that idea of individualization, and that when we do the evaluation, that it be comprehensive enough, that we're looking at all the possible areas of need that the referring person has identified, so that we have a chance to identify all those needs, not just the ones that would qualify the student for an other health impairment diagnosis. So you can't know what to do if you don't have a clear and comprehensive understanding of the student's need. And again, as I said, not a program that is the same for every student with a given label. So this is where input from parents, input from educators that have worked with the student, observations, multiple measures should be utilized to provide more information about what the student's needs may be. So let's say we're developing an IEP. and there hasn't been either an initial or reevaluation that year. Then it's important to bring information to the table of how the student has done over the past year. This could be classroom information, it could be information on standardized assessments, it could be important information from the parents about what's been going on at home, and if appropriate for the student themselves. So you start with the basics. So we're going back to that idea of the limited strength, vitality, and alertness. Remember, we talked about what it could look like. So again, with strength, the inability to perform typical routine tasks at school. Vitality, the inability to sustain effort or endure throughout an activity. Physical and mental strength, the capacity for endurance, the student's energy, animation, or activity. And then limited alertness, the inability to manage and maintain attention, to organize or attend, to prioritize environmental stimuli, including heightened alertness. So remember, they don't have to show all these, but they might show one of each or maybe not. So, for example, I did this thinking about a student I worked with many decades ago, but the needs that the student had included a limited school schedule, extra time to complete tasks because it took them longer than other students to finish any task. He also had difficulty with large tasks. So, for example, if the class was working on, say, 3 pages of math items, then maybe he would only get 1 page. We also needed support to help prevent being overwhelmed by tasks. So it might mean that you only got half of the one worksheet and then had to get the second one once you complete it, rather than having the full 2 pages or even the full 1 page. And he also needed help learning how to study new topics because he just hadn't been able to focus his attention appropriately. We also needed help organizing tasks and assignments and help with appropriate social interaction. Because we have to remember there are certain things that some of the more capable learners are able to pick up observing others and observing adults, or maybe getting something shown to them one time. But there are other students who may not be able to do that and may need to have explicit instruction and other information. Bonnie, am I still audible?
Yeah, well, we still have a little problem. It's sort of settling down now again. I don't know what the problem is.
Okay.
But let's apologize to everybody for the quality right now. Everything was working fine until we started. So let's just go ahead, and if I think I'll let you know to repeat, okay?
Yes, and again, I apologize. It's just that when I start hearing a lot on this end, I want to make sure that I'm still audible.
Yep.
Okay, so for example, what if we had a student that needed help to learn to study? Well, there are many different pieces of learning to study, and a starting point might be just learning how to complete homework. Well, at first that might not seem that difficult, but if you start doing the task analysis and thinking about what are all the different pieces of completing homework, then it becomes more complex, and you can recognize how this might make it difficult for students to complete it if they're having trouble with any of those of the 3 areas. So, for example, to complete homework, one step might be to start making sure that there is a list of all assigned homework for the day that is complete and has been checked by the teacher, and that could be marked by having the teacher initial it with due date. And I think that's really important because I know that when many people come home with homework, and I do over offer to help, it helps to prioritize which areas or which assignments will help with first because of those due dates. The next thing is to have a specific space at home where homework is completed, not in front of the television. Now, I grew up doing homework in front of television, but I also did a lot of multitasking, and as we now know, multitasking does not necessarily mean we're more efficient. We sometimes need to make sure that we're just paying attention to one thing. So,
Well, we're having a real problem right now.
okay.
Do you have your headset on, or?
Do I have? No, I don't have it on.
Okay, I just don't know what's going on today. So again, we have to apologize. It's kind of slowing down again. I don't know.
Okay, well, again, if you want to take away from me and then try again, I don't know if that would make any difference.
Maybe if you want to try to plug in the headset, maybe something will happen differently. I don't know.
Okay, let's see how that works. Okay, now can you hear me now?
Oh, much, much better. Yes.
Oh, good, good, excellent. That's what we want to have then. Okay, let me go back to where I was. My apologies, I hit the wrong button. Okay, so going back to learning how to study. So then the next thing is to break down a given assignment or task into more manageable parts. So again, as an adult, that means being able to figure out how to break that task apart. And it may be that you'll have to talk to the teacher in order to find out how they would see breaking it down into more manageable parts. One example is if the student gets overwhelmed by too much information in front of him or her, is that you can cover up portions so that they only see part of what needs to be done. And I gave the example of the student that I had where actually sometimes he would only be given half of an assignment, and then once that was completed, he'd go back and get the second half so that he didn't have that huge amount looming in front of him, which might trigger anxiety or distract him from the task. So the other thing is to schedule frequent breaks, because sometimes if you try and do too much at once, that reduces your efficiency and your efficacy in terms of being able to complete a task, and to potentially use headphones to block out distractions, as we are now by trying to keep the sound down. So some of what we were describing in the previous example is actually known as executive functioning. And what the homework example showed several areas of difficulty or disorder within executive functioning. So what is executive functioning? Well, it's actually to both the cognitive and mental abilities that we have and that we use to get things done. And it helps us figure out what actions we're going to do, controls our behavior, and motivates us to finish the task and prepare for future events. So, for example, I mentioned the being in a lecture and having something else going on outside and being able to redirect my focus and my attention back to the speaker, because that's the important source of information at that time. Now, Bonnie and I were actually talking earlier before we signed in about some of these topics around executive functioning. And one of the things that I had provided as a handout is actually a document about addressing executive functioning in an academic setting. There's also another document that I'm using that came from the ADD Etude website. It's a website about attention deficit disorder and learning difficulties. And there are many different resources that you can access around areas, including executive functioning. And the way that they talk about executive functioning is that there are 7 major types of self-regulation and that control our behaviors and make us more effective. And what's important to think about is that these are not, you need to have at least started the one and have that self-awareness before you can go to inhibition. Each one builds upon the next, but they're still interrelated. So for example, that self-awareness is self-directed attention. So do I know if I'm on task? Do I know what I'm doing and what's going on and what I need to do right now? You know, I can't just go and look out the window and watch the birds fly by because I'm in the midst of a webinar and I need to provide you with information. So even though I would like to go and watch the birds fly by, I am self-aware enough that I know I can't continue this presentation to do that, and therefore I'm able to inhibit or restrain myself from doing that. The next one is nonverbal working memory, and that's being able to hold things in your mind. And essentially it's visual imagery. So how do I know that there are birds outside my window? Because I've seen them before and I can remember that and hold that picture of the birds for when I finish, and I can then go and look out the window. The next one is, once you've mastered nonverbal working memory, is your verbal working memory. And this is also known as self-speech, being able to talk yourself through various steps and strategies. And this is also considered your inner monologue. So for example, I need to do laundry. And I know I had to go and find my dirty clothes, and I should probably be good and sort them and have, make sure that the whites are alone and the colors are together. Unless I'm feeling really lazy, and I'll just throw them all in. And then I have to think, okay, this is not good for the washer. It's not good for my clothes. But do I really care about that? So as I'm talking myself through this, going through the various pros and cons, I'm basically helping myself figure out what I need to do in order to complete the task. The next one is emotional self-regulation. And that's that ability to take all those 4 other areas and use them to manipulate my emotional state. So for example, I can use my own, if I'm starting to feel really frustrated with the task and I just don't want to do it anymore, it means I can use the words, my own words and images, my own self-awareness to process and change how I'm feeling. And instead of feeling frustrated, I can say, well, look, I've already gotten some of this done and I'm almost all the way done. Doesn't that feel good to finish that task? That's a way to self-regulate and work beyond emotions when it comes to some tasks. Then after that is self-motivation. So how well can I motivate myself to complete a task when there's no immediate external consequence? Well, right now I have enough clean underwear, but maybe I know I'll need more for the next several days. So I need to have that self-motivation to, okay, I really do need to do my laundry because otherwise I'll have some difficulties later on in the week. Then, and this can actually be very difficult. I use the example of finishing my master's thesis, which took 2.5 years longer than it should have. And that was because I needed to work hard to motivate myself to complete the task, but it seemed so overwhelming and it seemed like there was so much to do, and it just never seemed to get close to getting done until I actually ended up having an external impetus to complete that task. Basically, I was told I couldn't continue as a graduate assistant, and if I wanted to work, I needed to complete my thesis, and then I could actually get a permanent job. So that leads to the last part, which is planning and problem solving. So at that point, I had to come up with something new in order to get it done, and which ended up me being, I locked myself in the area where I had my computer, and I just sat and I had to work on it and get it done. No more waiting on it. It just had to get done. So I had to make sure I planned how I was going to do it, when I had to get it done, what forms I needed to complete it, to submit it to the graduate school, all those different pieces to make sure that I got it done, and then get ready to present it to my thesis committee, and what kind of fruits and sweets was I going to bring in to, kind of try and bribe them to not pay as much attention to it, pay attention to what I brought. That didn't work, but they were impressed with what I brought. So what I had to do is I had to take the task apart and then put it together in different ways, because maybe I would do one thing earlier than I did the last time, and come up with a solution to my immediate problem, which was to complete my thesis. And I did get it done, and I did get the job that I needed to keep me going, and it was one more thing off of my plate. So as I've described these, they're not necessarily things, again, that happened all at once. I didn't just wake up and know how to do all this. I was lucky in that I think I was very observant as I went to school, and picked up a lot of these things from watching the adults and my more successful peers. But I also know I had to really work at it, because I can be very distractible, or my focus might not be appropriate. For example, I love to read. I was always the kid who had the book in her desk, and I tried to get my work done so I could then read my book while everybody else was finishing, which teachers weren't always thrilled about. But again, I did learn how to do this, even though sometimes these days I feel like I have absolutely no control over my attention, my ability to do things. And I think that comes with just, we have many more things that change as we grow older, and it makes it different from what we have to do when we're at the student's level. Bonnie, was that you, or was that just?
No, we're good. We're good. We
Okay,
have about 15 minutes left.
great. Okay, so I'll try to get through a few more things, and then we'll have a chance to open it up to questions. So as we looked at this, what happens when this fails? And those of you who have children who might have executive functioning difficulties, you might actually recognize some of what I'm talking about here. Trouble analyzing, planning, or organizing, scheduling, and completing tasks. There's just no way they know how to do it. You have to provide intense scaffolding or support so that they can get the task done. What's important is to, again, recognize that you need to provide that explicit and direct instruction, as opposed to assuming that they know how to do it because we do, and as opposed to assuming that the way we do it is the best way for that student to do it. And that is where we need to have that complete picture of the student's needs, because maybe they can't handle frustration, or maybe they're really good about that, but they have trouble remembering and following multi-step tasks. I had a student who really didn't care that he couldn't complete a task. He was fine as long as you were fine. It was, so again, in order to motivate him was to give him those pieces and work with him on them, as opposed to having to teach him how to handle frustration, because he really didn't get frustrated. Another thing is that oftentimes it might be difficult to sustain attention, and this can be for a variety of reasons. It may not be because they have an attention disorder, but because they don't know how to moderate or regulate their feelings because of things that are happening in their lives, or something that's happened at home, or because they've suffered through trauma growing up and they don't know how to manage. And then I think this is one that I think is very important to remember, is that sometimes when you're younger, you have difficulty stringing together multi-step actions. You may need to have it broken down into smaller pieces, but then as you get older, you can string more of them together. One of the things I found is I have to write those things down. If I don't do it, then I'm going to skip a step and it's not going to work. Sometimes I try to do it without, and again, I end up having to repeat it or do it more than once. So again, what's really important to remember is that a difficulty with executive functioning does not mean that there is a cognitive disability. You can have really strong cognitive abilities, but yet still have difficulty with executive functioning because something else is going on. Okay, so we've kind of gone through this and we've talked about the different ways that you might see just one area, and that's that area of executive functioning. There are many, many other things that can also happen depending on what the student's needs are, but this is one of the more common areas that we see across different medical conditions. For example, you do also see executive functioning disorders in students who might be identified as having autism or on the autism spectrum, or that has depression or other emotional difficulties. So it's always important to say, okay, let's be careful we don't get stuck in the diagnosis. What we want to make sure that we're doing is that we are looking at the identified needs, and that goes back to the evaluation, it goes back to the referral, and it needs to be constantly updated, because as a student grows and matures, their needs may change or they may get more significant. But again, this is something that we should be watching anyways for any of our students who have disabilities and who might need that additional support in order to access the general education curriculum. Okay, so going back to this page that I mentioned earlier, the Other Health Impairment webpage, I'm in the process of taking a look at it and trying to determine what might need to be added, what needs to be updated. And if you have some suggestions, please email them to me. Then what I can do is I'll take that into consideration with the knowledge that I'm not the final voice. There are several layers above me, but I can certainly take a look at trying to include that. And then on the next page are some of the other resources, for example, that ADD Etude page. It's something that you might consider looking at for additional resources. Again, there's also the OHI page that I mentioned, as well as the traumatic brain injury page, because sometimes you will see some similar things happening. There's also an OCRD, Office of Civil Rights Dear Colleague letter and resource guide on attention deficit hyperactivity disorder that you can access. And then the book that I mentioned, the Tourette Syndrome and OCD Checklist, a practical reference for parents and teachers by Susan Connors, and that's available through Josie Bass Publishers. So, lots of information in a relatively short period of time. Are there some questions, Bonnie, that have come up?
Well, there is one question, Eva.
Okay.
And this particular person was interested in the fact that when you talk about limited strength and vitality and alertness during the course of like an IEP meeting, does that mean that the child has to have all three of those areas checked on that OHI checklist, or will any one of those areas do?
Pretty much any one of those areas will do, but I will be very hard pressed for almost any medical condition that's going to rise to the level of a possible disability not being seen across multiple areas. And I know that that's been a question, but if you go and look, the word or is used, not the word and. So whenever we're talking about or, that means one or the other or the other. If it said one and the other, then you would need to have it in each of the three areas.
So if the district says that our son doesn't have an issue in 2 out of those 3 areas,
Mm-hmm.
what do we do to convince them that it's not the and, it is the or?
Well, again, this is where you can actually show them uh, the law. Let me get back in here into those pages. And one of the things on the previous slides, let me go back to that. Okay, let me go back to previous. Okay, what I'm going back to is the definition. So again, on this slide where it says Wisconsin definition of other health impairment, it says having limited strength, vitality, or alertness. So you can show that slide. That's P11.36 parentheses 10 of the Wisconsin Administrative Code. And if the school is still saying that that's the reason that the child doesn't qualify, you're welcome to have them call me and I will walk them through it. But you also have to remember that they may have, they may meet that part, but they might not rise to the level of needing special education. So I would ask to get that clarified. Is that the reason? Is that because they didn't have it in all 3 areas? If so, then that's potentially an inappropriate identification. And what is the reason that the child is not considered, that the IEP team determined that the child did not qualify for special education? So again, you're always welcome to share this information and to encourage the school district to contact me. And if not, if the school district does not appear to want to contact me, then you can call me and ask me to contact them. And I'll be happy to do that. And I was mentioning to Bonnie that we do have a new system right now where the easiest way to get a hold of me, because if I'm on the road or working away from the office, if you call our team, the 800 number, and get shifted to the special education team and ask to be in contact with me to answer that question or to talk about that, then what they do is they'll send me a help ticket that will show up in both my email and in another area where we keep that information, and that way I'll have your contact information, and you can include your emails if you want me to email you something, and I'm more likely to access that because I'm not always able to access my voicemail when I'm traveling, but yet I usually can because it shows up in multiple electronics. So hopefully that's answered your question. If not, please feel free to call me and I will be happy to talk it through with you.
I have one other one that just came in to us.
Sure.
If a need is identified, can schools still do an informal plan? So in other words, a need's been identified, but they don't want to make it formal. They want to make it an informal plan. How would you handle that?
Is that the school wants an informal plan or that the parent
Yes,
wants an informal?
the school.
Okay. If a need is identified, so let's say that they showed that limited vitality, alertness, and strength, one of those areas, and everything else fit on the checklist, but that the IEP team felt that it did not rise to the level of requiring special education services, then that was that question of wasn't Section 504 evaluation included from the starting point? If so, then you could at that time develop a Section 504 plan. If not, then you can request a Section 504 evaluation. And at that point, they could use all that information, but it would be, you'd set up a separate meeting, and it might be a smaller group, and at that point determine if the student has an identified disability, but doesn't require special education, but does require accommodations, then you can develop a 504 plan. But again, there's certain steps that have to be gone through, and if you disagree with the outcome, there are several options that both Bonnie and I could share with you if you contact us directly.
Okay, thank you very much. Eva, any last words?
Just to say again, thank you for taking the time out of your busy day to listen to me talk about this. If you do have some further questions, you're welcome to contact me directly. And then also to acknowledge, I appreciate the partnership that DPI has with Facets, and that I have with Bonnie. We've known each other for several years, and it's helpful to know who the resources are out there. And I would encourage you to take advantage of Facets, which is a really exceptional parent center.
Well, thank you very much. Thank you, Eva, and thank you all who participated in our webinar today. This concludes our webinar. Again, thank you for joining us. Please be reminded that Wisconsin Facets has over 80 scheduled trainings and webinars for 2019. Please check our website calendar and register for any of the upcoming trainings that may be of interest to you. Also, please watch for the short evaluation that will be coming your way after the conclusion of today's live webinar. Sorry again for any difficulty as far as our interference in the audio, but I think toward the end, everything kind of cleared out. Thank you very much, everybody, and thank you again, Eva.
Thank you.